In a previous video on the channel, I talked about how the Galactic Empire repurposed old separatist technology during the early transitional years of the regime. But this time I'm talking about the progression from the Galactic Republic's tech and equipment to the Galactic Empire's. Over the course of the Bad Batch, we get a glimpse at the powerhouse of a military the newly formed Imperial government is with Project Warmantle. Headed up by Vice Admiral Rampart, Warmantle saw the introduction of many changes in the Empire. First off with the Elite Squad soldiers, which repurposed clone trooper armor with a new sleek black design and green visors, reflecting the future of the eventual Death Trooper commandos. The TK armor, which is the first generation Stormtrooper armor, saw its first use within this program, as far as we know, on Darrow inside the Imperial training base, and was worn by human recruits as opposed to clones. While the clone troopers would continue to primarily just wear the standard white armor, this served as the differentiation between the two types. The TK project would continue to grow and expand as the Defense Recruitment Bill was forced into effect by the Emperor, effectively replacing the clone army as the main fighting force, and the new troopers would be rebranded as Imperial Stormtroopers. This armor has seen a few variants as well, including shock trooper and pilot styles. It isn't clear when exactly the armor would evolve to the Stormtrooper armor we all know, but I'm sure a future project will expand on that. Similar to the Elite Squad troopers wearing variants of clone armor are the Phase 1 Purge troopers, who are styled in repurposed airborne trooper armor clad in black with red visors. These Jedi hunters would eventually get an armor update to better match their Stormtrooper underlings with their Phase 2 armor seen in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. The Viper-class probe droid and the other models that would follow were used very early on, in fact within the first few days of the Empire's formation. Prior to the regime change, it was primarily the Separatist Alliance that used probe droids with this sort of style to them, which makes sense since they were both designed by Arakid Industries. Arakid? Arakid? However you say that name. The DT Sentry droids are another droid type used pretty much instantly in the Empire on Kamino as a live rounds type of setting. It's unclear if the droids were already made during the Republic or if this is a new introduction, but considering this is within days after the change, I'll assume this was a Republic creation. Future iterations of the droid would have black-plated armor and were used in various military roles, such as on Nova Garon, Jeddah, as well as being sparring partners for Grand Admiral Thrawn. Let's talk weaponry. The clone army under the new regime used the standard DC-15 carbine primarily, which used blue blaster bolts, and sounded like a DC-15, the same as you'd hear in the Clone Wars. For the TK troopers, early on in their introduction, they also used blue bolted DC-15s, but with much more E11 sounding blaster effects. Eventually, the bolts would become red, along with continuing to have the sound of an E11, despite looking like a DC-15. This marked an interesting separation of stormtroopers from clones. The same goes for the clone commandos, as their DC-17M weapons once fired blue bolts, then would go on to fire red. We also see the change in officer blaster pistols, where officers in the Republic would have used the DC-17 blaster pistol, but in the Age of the Empire they held the RK-3 blaster pistol, standard issue for all Imperial officers going forward, such as Thrawn, Rampart, and others. Clones would still use the DC-17, however. Crosshair is also the first canon Imperial to use a red blaster bolt, at least I'm fairly sure of that fact, using his 773 Fire Puncher, which was modified to use red bolts, as well as his personal DC-17 pistol. The Elite Squad also used red bolted weapons, including a modified DC-15 rifle and carbine. The Purge troopers wielded various kinds of melee and long-range weaponry, including a modified DC-15 rifle, similar to that used by ESO-2. At this point, very minimal amounts of weaponry from the clone army would still be used by the Empire. But surprisingly, the Z6 rotary cannon would see use for several generations, being used in the Clone Wars, during the time of the Empire, and even the First Order. In terms of institutional changes, Rampart also introduced the chain code system, which allowed any and all civilians in possession of a chain code to be registered into the Imperial database. Imperial currency also became the standard, and all citizens could exchange Republic credits for the new ones. Let's talk ships and vehicles now. The new class shuttles in the Republic, once branded in red and yellow markings, became gray and dull, and evolving as the majority of variants would later have a large fin on top. This style was seen only a handful of times in the Clone Wars, such as when Clone Trooper Tup was being transported the first time, and in the Clone Wars finale when Maul is captured, but it would become much more widespread and a representation of the eventual change to the Lambda and Sentinel class shuttles, which Hunter actually mentions in the Bad Batch.
What class of shuttle? Lambda or Delta?
Lambda class.
Very good.
Other color swaps include V-Wings, LAATs, ATTEs, Juggernauts, and Venator class Star Destroyers, with the Venator decoloring echoing the ending of Revenge of the Sith as Vader and Sidious stand aboard one observing the Death Star's construction. A new addition to the Imperial fleet is the science vessels used for the operations on Mount Tantus, with their purpose being to hold specimens or transport essential cargo to and from Wayland. Alongside the new vessel are the Imperial orbital stations, which we would progressively see much more of by the time of Star Wars Rebels. The Imperial cargo vessels, such as the Class 4 container transports, were used quite frequently across the Empire's reign, seen transporting various treasures or spoils to and from planets like Corellia, Sereno, and Erebus, along with many other systems in the future. I already mentioned it in the Separatist technology video, but I'll bring it up again here, with the Empire making full use of the Gozanti-class cruiser as time goes on, initially being a prisoner transport ship, then becoming a staple of the Navy, transporting ground vehicles as well as small fighters without means of hyperspace travel, while also maintaining its roots in prisoner handling from time to time. The V-Wings are interesting as they start to sound more and more like TIE fighters as time goes on. In the early days, weeks, and months of the Empire, the V-Wing sounds like it normally does most of the time, but as the Bad Batch progresses, to the end it has the engine sounds of a TIE as well as the laser cannons. The LAAT gunship would continue to be used many times in the initial years of the Empire, eventually being retired and sort of replaced by the Sentinel-class shuttles as main trooper deployment vessels. But in several ways, the same can be said about the LAAT patrol gunship, which is seen on planets like Coruscant as police gunships during the Clone War, but would act as a local version of a gunship for the Empire. Additionally, the Architans class light cruiser would serve in both militaries, seeing plenty of action in both the Clone Wars and under the Empire, proving to be a beneficial vessel to blockade planets, act in response to insurgent activities, or even more sinister designs. Then of course, you have the Imperial Star Destroyer. I imagine this one we see here is the first Imperial Star Destroyer to ever be in service, and it's fitting that Tarkin is the one to own it. Of course, anyone who has seen the original trilogy or even the first few minutes of A New Hope knows the prevalence of the Imperial-class Star Destroyers, the primary warship of the Empire. What's fascinating is that despite the Venator going out of style, it continues to be involved in some capacity, seen flying above Coruscant in coordination with an ISD. Though I imagine the Venator would be relegated to more of a frigate-type vessel at this point than a capital ship like the ISD is. I'm going to assume the Acclamator is basically retired by this point, as it's practically never seen again in canon. In Legends video game titles, such as Empire at War, which is set in the Empire era, the player would be able to create the Acclamator-class ships, but beyond that, you never really see the Acclamator turn up very much. On the ground side of things, while the ATTE is used to enforce the Iron Fist of the Empire, new vehicles see action such as the AT-AC, or All-Terrain Armored Cannon, on planets like Ord Mantell after the Empire's arrival, seemingly being the first two-legged walker to replace the AT-RT. It would not be the last, however, as we would see other two-legged walkers come and go with the AT-DT, All-Terrain Defense Turret, seen during the Mimban campaign, and the AT-DP, the All-Terrain Defense Pod, used many times in the years before the Death Star is finalized. Eventually, the AT-AT, the All-Terrain Armored Transport, would become an essential part of the Imperial war machine, which was developed during the war against the Separatists and would see action very early on in the Clone Wars in Legends continuity, but would become much more streamlined in the military by 14 BBY in canon. I think I prefer it that way as opposed to Legends. I like the subtle implications of what the future holds, like the Space Triangle eventually becoming the Space Triangle. But having what is clearly an AT-AT used in the first few months of the Clone War is pretty bizarre, and I definitely prefer the ATTE being the bridge between eras. The BARC speeder bikes were used very often during the Clone War and early on in the Empire, but this design would eventually be done away in favor of the 614 AVA speeder bike used alongside the 74Z speeder, which were used in both eras. Admittedly, it gets pretty messy with vehicles like TIE Fighters and AT-STs because we see the TIE Interceptor used during Jedi Fallen Order, piloted by the Second Sister. However, the Interceptor wouldn't be used predominantly until the Battle of Endor 18 years later. Same goes for the AT-ST, which hadn't seen too much use prior to the Battle of Hoth, but makes several appearances in the Jedi games and otherwise. Is this a chronological sacrifice for the sake of compelling gameplay with recognizable vehicles, or is it an oversight? Either way, it makes videos like these much harder to pin down a concrete answer. And that's about it. Are there any other significant technological evolutions in the Empire that I missed? Let me know in the comments. This was definitely much more focused on the transitional changes from Republic to Empire, so ideally changes in that time frame. But let's keep the discussion going. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, share, tap the bell, become a member, all the fixes. Take care, stay awesome, and may the Force be with you.